Hello, this is Becky.
Hey, Becky, glad you could join us.
Me too. Nothing like computer trouble right at the
Oh,
last
yeah.
second.
Yeah, it looks like we're good to go. We've practiced passing control of the slides back and forth, and I think we're going to be okay.
All right. There we go. Well, I'm glad it left everything up and running for you,
Yeah.
even though it wasn't working on my end.
Hey, everybody, we're going to get started in a couple of minutes, but while we do wait to get started, if you'd please use the chat box at the right-hand corner of your screen to tell us who you are and where you're from, that would be great. If you're attending with one or more other people, please let us know how many other folks are sitting in with you today. Thanks. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so why don't we get started? We have kind of a full agenda today. If you haven't already done so, please use the chat box at the right of the screen to let us know who you are, which institution you're affiliated with, if any. And if you're attending with more than one person today, please let us know how many other people are sitting in with you today. I'm Bonnie Weddle. I am the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and co-chair of COSA's State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses on the Library of Virginia's work with the email archives of former Virginia Governor Timothy Kaine. This webinar is part of SERI's Spring 2019 webinar series, and future offerings will focus on locks, that is, lots of copies keep stuff safe, and the ways it can help state archives preserve electronic records of enduring value, blockchain technology as it relates to public record keeping, extraction of gubernatorial records and accompanying metadata from an intranet quorum system, and one state's development of policies and protocols for managing, preserving, and providing access to electronic gubernatorial records. We won't be having any webinars in July or August, but a fall 2019 slate of webinars is in the works. As the schedule firms up, we'll spread the word via COSA's website, listservs, monthly news briefs, and social media, so please stay tuned. I'd also like to call your attention to a new online educational resource that the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee has developed. Based upon the Library of Congress's digital preservation outreach and education curriculum and expanded to reflect the specific needs and concerns of state archives, Managing Digital Content Over Time is a series of videos that discusses the core activities associated with digital preservation, identification of the digital content you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing content appropriately, protecting it from inadvertent or deliberate loss or alteration, managing content over time, and provision of access. These videos are a modular, self-paced, and always available resource for employees who are new to your organization or to the topic of digital preservation. You'll find them on the website of the Utah State Archives, which graciously did the technical work needed to produce them, and is hosting them on behalf of COSA at the link you see on your screen. You'll soon be able to find a link to these recordings on the COSA website, and you'll also find the link in the February COSA news brief, which was distributed via email on Valentine's Day. And of course, when the recording of and slides associated with this webinar are posted on the COSA site, you'll be able to find the link in those files as well. And now on to the matter of hand. We're very fortunate to have two seasoned and knowledgeable presenters today. Roger Christman has worked at the Library of Virginia since 1997 in a variety of roles. His current position is Governor's Records Archivist. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Millersville University and a master's in public history from the University of South Carolina. Susan Gray Page is the library's digital archives coordinator, a position that she has held since 2002. She started volunteering at the library in 2010 while she was completing her master's degree in library and information science. Her favorite part of her current position is the challenge of developing streamlined and effective workflows for creating and managing the library's digital collections. And with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Roger. Please note that we are going to hold all questions until the end. However, if you have any questions,
Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Anybody? Because I just lost audio for a moment. I'm sorry.
Yep, I can hear you again now.
Okay. Well, if everyone else can, Bonnie, thank you for inviting us to this webinar. I think I want to begin with, since this is an update on the Kaine email project, that I'm happy to report after 7+ years, we're actually almost done. But I want to put that time in perspective. Virginia governors can only serve a single 4-year term. They cannot run for re-election. So Tim Kaine left office 9 years ago. We've had 2 other governors who have come and gone since then, Bob McDonnell and Terry McAuliffe, and our current governor, who you may have heard something about in the news, Ralph Northam. To put that in perspective, another way to put it in perspective is going back to this slide here. My son's now 8 years old. I've been working on this practically as long as he's been alive. So what started out as a manual step-by-step reviewing each email process has evolved now. We're finishing it with using predictive coding, and Susan Gray is going to talk more about that in her part of the presentation. Last week, Nagara had a webinar, The Promise of Predictive Coding Tools for Archives and Records Management, talking about the work being done at the University of Illinois using Illinois State Governor's Records. And one of the speakers, Jason Barron, he's now his former director of litigation, basically he said archivists are going to need these tools to process large collections of email. Well, I think the main takeaway from this is the library's Kaine email project is proof of that concept. You cannot manually do this. We knew that from the start going in, this was not sustainable, but now you're going to need these tools and use us to make your case for getting the funds for these tools, saying, look at those crazy people in Virginia tried to do this manually. That's not sustainable. It took them forever to do it, twice as long as the governor was in office. You're going to need these tools. And that's okay. Go ahead and use us as an example like that. But having said that, we're proud of what we've accomplished because we've learned a lot along the way. This project has impacted the library's records management training for the governor's office, highlighted the need for electronic transfer procedures from state IT to the library. There have been challenges around training other archivists to process email. Recent legislation almost passed by the Virginia General Assembly reinforces the need to constantly educate stakeholders on electronic records issues, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But I think the best part of this project was our introduction to two computer science professors at the University of Waterloo. This led to the library experimenting with artificial intelligence / predictive coding to process email more efficiently. And based on the legislation I just mentioned and referred to, we're going to need all the help we can get in that area. So 4 parts to today's webinar. I'm going to give a quick update on the Kaine email project. The second area will be focusing on education of stakeholders for managing and transferring electronic records. I'll also discuss processing and training other archivists to process email, and Susan Gray will discuss our collaboration with Waterloo. Now, while our examples are strictly for Virginia, it's our hope that, the lessons learned, you can pick and choose from what we talk about to see what works for you. This is a Kaine overview by the numbers. So the Cliff Note version of the project is Governor Kaine was Virginia's governor from 2006 to 2010. He's now a United States Senator. At the end of his administration, they transferred 1.5 million emails and over 1,100 PST files from over 200 staff members. As I mentioned, we did the manual review of all this material because we are putting it online, not in the reading room, but on the internet. You can access this from anywhere. And we needed to review, to appraise, and weed out non-records, non-archivable records, restricted records, flagging records for redaction. Then we converted them to PDF, and they're full-text searchable in our digital asset managing system, Digital. And where we are today. As of right now, we reviewed 942,282 emails. About 800,000 of those were manually done. From that number, we got 308,046 archival records and 283,901 open records that are available online. The difference there with the restricted material. But I'm going to get into that wide gap between what we reviewed and what we actually discovered was archival. So what's left? The stuff in blue on here has been done. What's left is in green. And that includes, or is being worked on. The green stuff is everything we're using predictive coding for. One individual staff member is still working manually on the Secretary of Natural Resources, but we're using predictive coding for the rest. And Susan Gray will talk more about that later. Since we released it 5 years ago, the collection has been used in a couple different ways. Obviously, when Senator Kaine was the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 2016, the press used the collection extensively, especially Politico. But 2 books had been written or about to be published that used this collection. One was from 2017, The Climate of Capitulation, an insider's account of state power in a coal nation by a former professor at Virginia Tech, Vivian Thompson. And there's a book coming out in April after Virginia Tech, Gun Safety and Healing in the Area of Mass Shootings by Tom Kapsadelis. Our whole view for this project from the start was it was always an access project. And I've summarized it very simply, like access is preservation, that we needed to put this material online to show the value of this content, get it out of the statistics about how much we have, and tell stories and encourage others to use for it to hopefully build support for the resources we need for digital preservation. And it works, but not in the way we expected necessarily, and that's what I'm going to get to next with the legislation that's going in the Virginia General Assembly right now. So as I indicated, Governor Kaine left 9 years ago. So meanwhile, while we've been working on that, the email backlog is growing, and it's exploding really. Governor McDonnell, when he left office after 4 years, gave us over 8 million items in PST files, most of those email. Governor McAuliffe, who left last year, 8.5 million. These records, unprocessed gubernatorial records in Virginia, are closed until they've been processed and aren't subject to FOIA. But this backlog has caught the attention of the press. Last year, we received a FOIA request for Governor McAuliffe records for information on two controversial natural gas pipelines going up in Virginia. And the requester for that information contacted the newspaper, and we got this first story indicating the backlog that we have. I was interviewed for it. Chad Owen, who's our FOIA officer, Sandy Treadway, the state librarian, we all talked to the reporter about it. And, our view is we're not happy this is taking so long either, but we didn't have the resources to do this any faster. Though at the time when we talked to them, the work with Waterloo and predictive coding looked very promising. So while that's out there, out of the blue and without any consultation to the library, the House Majority Leader in Virginia, Todd Gilbert, introduced legislation that would require the library to process these gubernatorial records within 1 year of receipt, which is basically a year after they left office. Now, the press release, as you can see here, said they wanted it made available online immediately. And the legislation doesn't say that, but that's their intent. They wanted this online immediately. And they did not include any appropriation for doing this at the time. So this obviously begs the question is, we need to educate the legislature on these issues and the challenges of making this stuff available. If we could have done it faster, trust me, we would have done it faster. And Sandy Treadway, the state librarian and state archivist, along with several members of our library board, met with members and staff of members of the General Assembly. We talked with our planning and budget, and we came up with a physical impact statement about what this would actually cost to do this. This legislation right now is in conference committee. There are two different versions of it, and one had an appropriation, one didn't. So we're anxiously waiting and hoping that we'll get the money to do this. Otherwise, I don't want to even think about it otherwise. But it'll also open up the question. Here's another quote, and this will be the section on educating stakeholders. Peter Slaybaugh is the Director of Communications for the Speaker of the House in Virginia, Kirk Cox. And his comment in the press release about this legislation, since Tim Kaine was governor, Apple has released 16 versions of the iPhone, yet we are still waiting to read emails sent from his BlackBerry. And it gets worse. The state senator who sponsored the different version of this bill in one of the committees used WikiLeaks as a model for us to release this stuff. If WikiLeaks can do it, why can't the library do it? So yeah. So in this section, I'll just sort of, we've sort of mentioned this, the education of stakeholders from the legislative branch, but I'm going to talk about also how the need to educate stakeholders from the governor's office and state IT on how to manage and transfer records to the library. Now I'm going to bring this back up. Behind the numbers, I referenced this earlier. The yellow there, in those columns, are basically all the records that we deemed were either non-records, they were personal in nature, or they were not permanent archivable records. And we were really surprised by this number when we first got into it. And the reason we were surprised is because we had a really good relationship with the Kaine administration when it came to records management training. We explained all of the specific schedules that each office had, general schedules, what material needed to be restricted. They had a central records officer who coordinated all this thing beautifully for the administration. And we had quarterly meetings as needed to touch base with the records officers. In addition to that, the Kaine administration, they created an electronic data archival policy, which you see here on the left on the screen, and they even rolled out PST files for each individual with a file structure based on each office's record retention schedule. So they'd have the name of the series and a number with it, with the theory that you would folder your records like that. Each folder would be a series. So we expected the Kaine email to be ready for a quick release. Yeah, what happened? Actually, nothing was wrong with the training we provided. Basically, what it came down to was our guidance was too complicated to be implemented by this particular audience. We were asking them to do something they were not capable of. And why is that? Governor's office employees in Virginia are considered at-will employees. They serve at the pleasure of the governor. So unlike classified state employees like myself, governor's office staff are short-term employees. Their job, since the governor's only there 4 years, their job has a shelf life of 4 years or less. So the type of training we would give other permanent classified agency staff members really didn't apply here because they weren't going to be around long enough. And basically, with everything we talked about, general schedules, specific schedules, et cetera, we were asking them to basically do archivable appraisal. And that's not possible because they didn't have the time. As we discovered when we started going through the Kaine email, these individuals were getting hundreds of emails a day. They literally don't have time to deal with this content in the short time that they're in office. Another issue where things got confusing is the Freedom of Information Act. They often confuse the retention schedules with that because the Freedom of Information Act in Virginia, like others, have various exemptions, and they assumed because something was exempt from FOIA, therefore it would be restricted and didn't have to come to the archives. Also, because they were short-timers, a lot of that stuff is in the non-permanent category are records where the disposition, it was non-permanent, but they had to retain them for more years than they were in office, like FOIA requests for 3 years. So they couldn't actually destroy those records. Many times they would leave after 2 years in office. The retention for some of their content, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, so they weren't there to clean it up. And really, that jump in the number going back from what we received from Kaine to McDonald and McAuliffe really just reflects the widespread use of mobile technology and how people are now accessible 24/7. The Kaine email indicated that only a senior staff had BlackBerries. When you get to McDonald and McAuliffe, everyone has a smartphone. They can access their email. They can be available at any time of the day. And that creates more records. It's also created issues with staff turnover, which has an impact on the transfer of these records and how those records are managed after someone leaves the administration, but before they're transferred to the library. So we didn't really fully realize this until the end of the McDonald administration and the beginning of the McAuliffe administration in 2014, 2015. Because we started the processing with the Kaine email. We thought this is great. And we didn't alter our training along the way. It wasn't until McAuliffe that we finally realized we needed to alter our approach, or the Groundhog Day for records management would continue. We would keep expecting a different result, and we weren't going to get one. So what was the solution? I just like this quote here. This is FDR and me here. The governor's office needs bold, persistent records management experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, frankly admit it and try another. But above all, try something. So we took a step back and came up with a list of what we thought would work and could be implemented given the unique status of members of the governor's office. And we came up with 3 things in particular to focus on. The need for a central records officer. The records management training needs to start during the transition period and the onboarding of new employees. And we really need to emphasize the library governor's office partnership. The woman for the central records officer, the woman on the right in this photo is Amber Amato. And she was the records officer for Governor Tim Kaine, the central records officer. And she spoiled us. I mean, she did all the things that I mentioned earlier, coordinating meetings, helping with those policies, et cetera. We haven't been able to replicate that. We've tried that with Governor McDonnell, McAuliffe, and Northam, and we just have not been able to succeed with that. But we think that's the perfect model, because Amber, in her position, had the clear responsibilities and expectations and authority to do this. She was empowered to do this. She was in a position, she was the head of constituent services. She was not just a lowly administrative assistant who didn't have time to achieve. She took this upon herself, and we've never been able to find another Amber. The second area is records management needs to start at the beginning. We had a really good relationship with the Kaine administration, and we thought, oh, everything we did in the Kaine administration would carry over and we could just do it with McDonnell. But we forgot something. We forgot that past performance is no guarantee of future results. We could not replicate the Kaine model with Governor McDonnell when he came in office. We attempted to identify a central records officer, and without success. The libraries didn't even meet with the McDonnell administration at any significant level till August of 2014, 7 months into the administration. And the results was the transfer of both paper and electronic did not go well. And I'll talk about the electronic one a little later. So we regrouped, and for when McAuliffe came in 2014, we were able to get a one-page records management document inserted in the briefing binders for the incoming cabinet members. The records analyst for the library, for the governor's office at the time, Anita Vanucci, and I were able to attend the first cabinet meeting and the first deputy cabinet meetings to give a brief overview of records management, and we followed it up then with smaller meetings within each office. We still didn't find that central records officer, but we did create a good relationship with the counselor to the governor. For Ralph Northam, when he came into office last year in 2018, Glenn Smith, who's our current records management analysis for the governing officer, revised the one-pager for them. We were able to give a short presentation to the cabinet within the first 2 weeks of the administration. And we're also able to build a relationship with the deputy counselor for the governor during the transition. My name was given to her to do some research for her. They wanted to release, to do an executive order, and they wanted some research based on previous stuff. So I was able to start cultivating a relationship with the incoming administration at that point. And that leads into the third area, which is the emphasis on customer service between the library can provide to the governor's office. This is something we've always done, but we really tried to emphasize that to show the value of what we have, that this was not a one-sided relationship of us telling them to fill out forms and do things a certain way, but that we had something to offer them and that we were here to help them do that. For the McAuliffe and the Northam administration, I've done extensive research on for oaths of office, updating their flag protocol, legislation, clemency files. And I think they've appreciated how we've acknowledged the uniqueness of their office, the short-term staff members, and how we've tried to adjust the training to make things more simple for them. The email now, instead of focusing on the different schedules, what's permanent, what's a record that's non-permanent. We just focused on the low-hanging fruit and encouraged them to get rid of the personal items and get that stuff out of there. We simplified the records retention schedules. Before, each cabinet office had their own. Glenn Smith created a general schedule for the cabinet. Glenn helped do the paperwork for the paper transfer and, helped box the materials up. I helped box materials up as well and transfer the stuff out of there. I mean, we have videos and good training on how to do that, but given this office and the time crunch to make this transfer happen, it was just easier for us to do it for them. And with that relationship, they actually invited us to participate in an event that they called, the Northam administration called Archiving in August. And Rita Davis is the counselor to Governor Northam, and what it was is they developed a practical approach to the Conflict of Interest Act and Virginia Public Records Act, and they invited us to participate. And the whole point was to try to, again, simplify this process. They made it fun. They pretty much made people come, but they had ice cream and cookies, so most people would come for that. And they asked us to participate, to give some examples of what are records and what are non-records. So I tried to focus on a handful of non-records that would be memorable to show from previous governors to get them to take this stuff out of their email prior to coming to the library. And one is this example about the governor's bathroom, that it is spewing forth that smell again. Can you send someone over to put that stuff in the drain before Friday? Thanks. And this is for all the cat lovers out there. I know Bonnie had a cat with her picture in this. An update on my my cat Frank. Turns out he's a lady. Whoops. Maybe if you call her Frankie, that's cute. And the final one I used was someone submitted this on a web form for the governor, the senior advisor to the governor for workforce development. And it says, "Are you really pregnant with my husband's child?" And it goes on from there. One thing, an example that I mentioned that would have been nice if we could have done this is there was a 17-page email thread between a couple who were having a fight. And they did this all on work email. And we pitched the idea, my wife was down with this, to do a reenactment of some of that because the male in the relationship really got it handed to him. And my wife really liked that. And we thought about doing a Not Ready for LVA Primetime Players Presents sort of reenactment of that. Cooler heads prevailed, and we didn't do that. But I did mention that, so making it simple, making it like these are obvious things you need to get out of here. You can do this pretty easily. And the administration tried to make this fun and as a carrot and a stick approach. They came up with a series of challenges for staff members to do things to their email box to clean them up. And each time you did that, you got a little prize, and you got to enter your name into the grand prize drawing, which was a paid day off in December. And I was told recently that this presentation is now being used for when new staff members come on board. So while we're not over there actually talking to them just yet, it's there for them to use. Another big challenge has been for educating is the transfer of electronic records from the state IT to the library. And Virginia, we have a public-private partnership. It was with Northrop Grumman. The contract's now been broken up into several other companies, but at the time that I'm talking about, it was all Northrop Grumman. And we've had some real problems with these transfers, and we're not sure how we can fix some of this, to be quite honest. The Kaine transfer, which it was what spurred this project, was fine. I mean, it was perfect. For the most part, we knew where everything was. It was pretty easy to do. As I referenced earlier, the McDonald transfer, both paper and electronic, was a complete mess. I'm not sure how much of that was in part because of Governor McDonald's legal troubles. He was being investigated on federal corruption charges while he was in office. He was indicted after he left office. He was found guilty, and the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his sentence, and he did not serve. He was not retried. But that's sort of the backdrop, because in 2013, the library reached out to VITA, the Virginia Information Technologies Agency, to prepare for the transfer of electronic records from McDonald. And VITA refused to give us an estimate of what they had. And they added they had no plans to transfer records to the library without express permission from the governor's office, ignoring the statutory requirements they do so by the end of the administration. And at the end of the administration in January 2014, they did not transfer the electronic records to us. We received the first transfer 2 months later in March 2014, but it was pretty clear that it was incomplete. There was a lot of missing email from various staff members. In 2014, they transferred over 200 laptops from the governor's office to the library. There had been a legal hold on these machines, and this was unrelated to the McDonald criminal indictment that I talked about earlier. And we had a limited amount of time to get all the records off these machines. However, not all of them were identified as to who they were, not by name, just the weird Vita logging identifiers that they used. It was also, before they left office, that Governor McDonald's counselor informed us that the governor had been using a personal Gmail account for public business during almost his entire time in office. And did we need to have that? And we're like, yes, we do need to get that. We did work with, the governor had other things on his mind. He was being tried in federal court, but we were able to get copies of that Gmail, but 3 years later, in January 2017, when Terry McAuliffe came into office, we wanted to avoid a repeat of this McDonald transfer. So what happened, in part, is the counselor's office, they wanted to transfer email of departing staff to the library prior to the end of the administration, sort of a digital record center. They'd still be the custodians, but we would have a copy of it here. Those were done with flash drives, and they were brought over like that in about 5 or 6 different transfers. However, not all of those flash drives were brought over, as we discovered later, that some of the material was taken off laptops and never given to us, and we didn't find this out till like a year later. And as we stand right now, there's still a handful of staff members we have not received email from the McAuliffe administration. So what have we learned from all of this? Is we learned, obviously, that state ID did not have documented exit procedures for members of the governor's office. Part of that is IT staff turnover. We've dealt with different individuals for many of these transfers. That's been a high priority with the Northam administration to make sure they have procedures that are followed by state IT as people leave, so these records are preserved and easily discoverable and transferred to the library when it comes time. The other thing this really led to was something that I compiled was the need to compile a staff directory in real time of administration personnel. It's something I had done at the cabinet level, but by the time we got to McAuliffe, I was creating, instead of a spreadsheet, a database and tracking through various sources, press releases, the state employee directory, websites, etc. Every employee in the governor's office, because there's pretty high turnover, as I referenced earlier, because of email. In part, Kaine had 200 staff members, McDonald had over 200, McAuliffe had over 400, and after a year of the Northam administration, they've had 168. You need this type of list to do the inventory of the email to make sure you got everything. And we have tried to incorporate that in our records management training. I know Glenn Smith asked the McAuliffe people to provide us a list at the end of the administration of who was there in their office. Not everyone did. The Northam administration is asking the executive assistants in each office to keep a list. I'm not taking their word on it, so I'm continuing doing the database, and hopefully that'll match up or come pretty close to what the administration is doing. And the other part of the procedures that we really are trying to get them to change is that they're transferring user profiles from laptops, which contain all these program files that we don't need. I think in part they're afraid of giving us, of not transferring something they should have. But we're trying to work on them because we don't need this stuff and we got to clean it out. this is staff. The final area is staff training challenges. This has been really difficult. There's a real big learning curve, not so much of the mechanics of processing email, but understanding what you're looking at. And it's been a lot of trial and error on my part in trying to come up with something. I went through some of these early mailboxes multiple times, and part of the learning curve is not only the content, but it's the mixed series that are in here. You can have, unlike a paper series, legislative files are all in one thing. With email, you can have anything in there. You're going to have to know the whole range of retention schedules as to going through this stuff as to how long you need to keep something, if it's permanent, if it's restricted, etc. Because this email, you're getting things in the back door that we did not receive previously in paper. Social services case histories, health records, a lot of personnel records, personnel items and actions. That was something the University of Illinois mentioned in their Nagara webinar that they were finding quite a bit. It's not the Social Security numbers that often is pointed out as something in there. It's all these other things that are in here that we really haven't had to deal with before, but it's coming in because someone complains to the governor. They refer to the appropriate agency, but in the response, you may get an entire case history that gets CC'd to the governor's office, or the social services agency gives the governor's office the entire case history in an email. So we've had to try to revise our restriction guidelines as well to take this stuff into account. One thing that I've tried to do to help with the context is create an electronic vertical file of articles, press releases, reports about the administration. It's not comprehensive, but it gives you a starting point of what the big issues were, et cetera. And this could be used hopefully by archivists for these future governors for processing those records. And I want to give one final example of just the nuance here of and the complexity of processing email. This is an email thread because I'm a big nerd and I follow and like government and public policy and stuff like that and the people involved. I knew what this thread meant immediately, but I don't think anyone else would necessarily know the significance of this if you saw it just as I'm presenting it here. They're just talking, this is between two individuals. I knew immediately by the time what this is. They're just asking, is he okay? Who is this? What are they talking about? It's an execution. Governor Kaine and Larry Roberts personally opposed capital punishment, but they said they would not impose their beliefs over the sentences and the laws of Virginia. Sherry Harrington was his longtime assistant. You had the whole thread here as you were looking at it. You could see that then, but I want you to remember this as Susan Gray begins talking about predictive coding and how that works, that you may not get this entire thread to help you figure out how important this is. And that leads to the final part of our talk, which will be Susan Gray on LVA and predictive coding. And I agree with Ken Brockman here. I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords, and Susan Gray can help tell us what it's all about specifically. And I'll pass it over to Susan Gray.
Thanks, Roger, and hi, everyone. My name is Susan Gray Page, and I'm the Digital Archives Coordinator at the Library of Virginia. And I've actually been working on the Kaine email project since my first day as a paid employee of the library back in May 2012. Now, when Bonnie introduced me, she mentioned that I like the challenge of creating workflows for digital projects. And the two things that I'm always weighing are sustainability and scalability. Can we make it last, and can we make it work on a larger collection of records? When Roger first started processing the Kaine email, as he mentioned, we were fully aware that sustainability and scalability could be a big problem. But at the time, we had the benefit of not knowing that Kaine's successor was going to transfer more than 5 times as many emails to us at the end of his term. And we really couldn't think of another way to make the records easily accessible to the public while also ensuring that restricted materials were appropriately excluded. So we decided to do the best we could with what we had at the time and just constantly reevaluate the project. Now here is where I'd like to stop and offer a quick plug for participating as a presenter in a conference or an informational webinar like this one right here. Even before we published our first batch of processed Kaine email, we were talking about the project to anyone who would listen. Roger and I presented at Best Practices Exchange in Salt Lake City 2 months before our first release, and we recruited colleagues there from across the country to see if they could crash our site, which they did. We didn't specifically ask for help on the actual processing of the emails, but I think we tried to make clear that we were sailing in uncharted territory and trying to be okay with not knowing where we would end up. We said we were open to better ideas. Now, almost a year after publishing our first batch, I got an intriguing email from Brent West at the University of Illinois. Hi, Brent. Brent said he was leading a project within the university to apply a capstone-like approach to email preservation for the university's senior administrators. And he wanted to know if I was free to chat about our experience and give him some feedback on his ideas for his own project. He had heard about the Kaine email project from Chris Stenson, who was at the Illinois State Archives at the time. And in exchange for our feedback on his project, Brent casually mentioned that he just happened to know some e-discovery experts who might really like to get their hands on our Kaine email data set. He arranged a call, and that is how artificial intelligence first entered our world in the form of 2 people whom we have come to call our Canadian superheroes. So meet Maura Grossman and Gordon Cormack. In 2015, when we first spoke to Maura and Gordon, thanks to Brent, Gordon was a computer scientist at the University of Waterloo, and he still is, and Maura was an attorney in private practice who was also an expert in e-discovery. And she now actually teaches at the University of Waterloo with Gordon. The 2 of them were 2 of the coordinators for the Text Retrieval Conference, which is a research workshop focused on information retrieval. It's co-sponsored by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the U.S. Department of Defense. Gordon and Maura were very interested in using the Kaine email as a data set for testing a form of artificial intelligence called technology-assisted review, which is where a computer helps a human, like Roger, do the job of finding certain records faster and with more accurate results. Because we had a pile of approximately 400,000 emails that Roger had already sifted through and categorized, our data set provided actual human results against which Gordon and Maura could compare a computer program's ability to perform Roger's job. Well, we love to try new things, so we pretty much agreed right away, and they used the subset of processed Kaine email in the 2015 Text Retrieval Conference. But I think our skepticism and the ability of artificial intelligence to replace Roger's manual workflow is reflected in the name we gave the project, Man versus Machine. As Roger mentioned in his discussion at the end of his presentation about the challenge of training other archivists to process email, context is key in email, and human shortcuts like just plain keyword searching don't always cut it. Thankfully, artificial intelligence is way smarter than we realized, and the results of the TREC experiment revealed that tools using technology-assisted review ended up agreeing with Roger's assessments 80 to 90% of the time, and they worked much faster. After seeing those results and simultaneously staring at the remaining Kaine emails, plus the 8 million emails transferred by the administration of Kaine's successor, Roger was ready to take the plunge completely and deploy Gordon and Mora's specific version of technology-assisted review on a completely untouched batch of Kaine email. So how does it work? Okay, I get nervous whenever I present on artificial intelligence because computer science obviously isn't my field of expertise, and I'm afraid I'm going to flub the explanation. Thankfully, Gordon and Mora have published a little explanation that I like to think of as artificial intelligence for dummies, and there's a link to their article on this slide. And here's the explanation in a nutshell. Now, CAL stands for Continuous Active Learning, and it's Gordon and Mora's method of performing technology-assisted review. So at the outset, CAL resembles a web search engine, presenting first the documents that are most likely to be of interest, followed by those that are somewhat less likely to be of interest. Unlike a typical search engine, however, CAL repeatedly refines its understanding about which of the remaining documents are most likely to be of interest based on the user's feedback regarding the documents already presented. CAL continues to present documents, learning from user feedback until none of the documents presented are of interest. Okay, now I'm finally getting to the part of the story where Roger actually used artificial intelligence to process a batch of Kaine email. And I need to start just by giving a thumbnail sketch of the mechanics of how Roger processes emails. We receive the emails in the form of PST files, and Roger opens the PST files in Microsoft Outlook. Then he creates folders within the PST file and he labels them open, open redact, restricted, and non-record, because that's how we categorize email or records. So as Roger reads the emails, he uses Outlook's categorization tools to color code the messages. So say green for an open record, yellow for something that needs to be redacted before we can put it in our collection, or red for something that's restricted. When he's done reviewing, he drags all of the green emails, say, into the open records folder and all the yellow into the redaction folder and so forth. And then he goes on to the next PST file. And once he's done with a set of PST files, he gives the files to me, and I use a tool called PST Viewer Pro to convert the emails in the open or redact folders into PDFs. And those are the PDFs that we serve to the public through Digitool. So we chose the Secretary of Education emails for jumping into artificial intelligence with both feet. And you can see on this slide how we stopped being skeptical and full-on embraced man plus machine. We started by giving the unprocessed PST files to Gordon and Mora, and these files comprised 180,000 email messages. Gordon converted the emails to text, and then his tool then read the text and used it to score the emails according to the likelihood of being an open record, or basically non-restricted and archival. Using how the tool was trained in the 2015 TREC conference, he created a first batch of emails for Roger to review. And he was able to do this in such a way that Roger could review the emails in Microsoft Outlook as he has from the beginning. The difference here was that the tool was suggesting which emails Roger should start with based on which ones were most likely to be non-restricted. Roger reviewed each batch and dragged the emails into folders. At the end of a batch, Gordon would retrieve the results, retrain the tool, and prepare a new batch. Because the tool gets smarter as it goes, Gordon and Mora have compared the process of using it to popping popcorn. You start off slow as the kernels heat up. This means that at first the tool gets it wrong as it learns, and it shows you stuff that isn't an open record. But just like with popcorn, when things start heating up, the payoff is pretty impressive. So this slide shows the ratio of non-records to open archival records found in each batch, prepared by Gordon's tool and delivered to Roger. You can see in the beginning where the bag of kernels is just getting warmed up, and there are still a large percentage of non-records to wade through. But then you can see that when Roger got to batch 4, almost everything in it was an open record. This continued in batches 5 and 6, and then started to decline as the number of open records left to be found got smaller and smaller. When you're popping popcorn, the safety mechanism for not cooking it too long while waiting for those last kernels to pop is the burning smell coming from your microwave. Now, thankfully, Gordon came up with a more elegant solution than setting Roger's computer on fire. He had Roger complete a random sample batch at the beginning and use the results of that to approximate how many open records Roger could expect to find in the entire pile of Secretary of Education emails. And that number was borne out by Roger's results reviewing the batches. Okay, so when trying to quantify time savings when using artificial intelligence, the key metric is how many records did you have to look at to find substantially all of what you were looking for. For the Secretary of Education emails, Roger alone would have had to look at all 180,000. Instead, Roger, aided by the machine, looked at only 44,000. So 44,000 is less than 180,000, and this made Roger very happy. After we released the processed emails from the Secretary of Education last fall, we decided to go whole hog on using artificial intelligence to finish the remaining Kaine email, which is roughly 500,000 more messages. Random sampling suggests that there are about 120,000 non-restricted archival messages to be found, and Roger is currently on batch 4 of those messages. That is still a lot of emails to look at, 120,000. But Roger started to get excited about seeing a light at the end of the Kaine email tunnel. And we even started sketching out plans to run some different types of experiments with Gordon and Maura, such as bringing another archivist into the mix in an artificial intelligence game we were going to call Face Off. And then the 2019 state legislative session got underway. So what happens now? As Roger mentioned, there's currently legislation pending that could turn everything on its head for us by requiring us to address our backlog of gubernatorial records in a very compressed time period. And we're still in a holding pattern to find out if the legislation passes and if funding is provided to us. So unfortunately, right now, all I can say is stay tuned for the next chapter. So finally, I'm going to pass control of the slides back to Bonnie, but thank you to everyone for listening, and we look forward to answering any questions you might have. Are you there, Bonnie?
I'm sorry. I must have inadvertently hit my mute button. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and I'll be reading the questions aloud as they come in because we are recording this webinar. If you have questions that arise after the webinar ends, please feel free to email Roger and Susan Gray. I don't see any questions in the chat box quite yet. I know it takes people a moment to type things in. I do have one question, and that is, did you get any pushback from the powers that be when you proposed sharing these emails with researchers outside of Virginia state government?
A little bit. Just in terms of how to ensure that the materials stayed restricted and weren't shared with anyone that they shouldn't be. We ended up making Gordon and Maura library volunteers because all volunteers at the library have to sign paperwork that indicates that they won't share any confidential material with anyone. So it ended up being a pretty simple solution, but it definitely was a bit of a concern.
Okay, thanks. And we have some other questions that have rolled in. First, is this analytics software that Gordon and Maura were using available, or is it still in test mode? Is there a cost to using it?
Right now, we are using it for free because we're basically in a research partnership with them. Going forward, they do offer they don't have an off-the-shelf product. They do offer their services to primarily law firms for a fee. Right now, they've been helping us for free because there's a benefit to us, and then they also publish, which is part of their bread and butter as professors.
Okay. All right. And does the predictive technology address attachments in any way?
Yes. The emails that we convert to PDF include the attachments as well, and so all of that is full text and is extracted by Gordon when he is feeding it to the tool, so that's factored in.
Okay, great. And specifically, how long did it take for the technology-assisted review to accomplish the task versus Roger by himself?
Roger, did you keep numbers?
I did, but I don't have them close by.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've tried to, because we had to get the whole system up and running with Gordon, we lost some time at the beginning. But that's why we realized it made more sense to factor in how many fewer emails Roger actually had to read in order to figure out time savings. And he had to read about a quarter of them instead of 108,000.
Which is
usually, I think on average, I can review 200 to 300 emails an hour, so you can extrapolate from that.
okay. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I will keep an eye on the chat box. Those are all of the questions we received. And as I said before, if you have any questions that arise, right when the webinar closes, please feel free to email Roger and Susan Gray.
Bonnie, I see a question in the Q&A section.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
But it's about the paper that I mentioned, and the URL is actually on one of the previous slides, which I think,
okay.
Bonnie, you said is going to be available to everyone. Is that right? Okay.
Yes. They will be available on the COSA website shortly on the SERI webinars page. Okay, I'm still not seeing any other questions, but I just wanted to remind everybody, when you close out of this webinar, a brief evaluation will appear on your screen. We really do read these evaluations. There were several of you who suggested last year that each webinar description should include information about target audience and level of technical knowledge that attendees should possess. We've taken that into account, as you can see, from the descriptions of the Spring 2019 webinar offerings. We also draw upon these evaluations when developing future webinars and, coming soon, future online educational videos. So we'd be really appreciative if you take just a few moments to complete the evaluation. And I see one more question has come in. And as regards the proposed legislation, is anyone making any changes or clarification regarding what is restricted under FOIA? For instance, in Texas, certain types of email addresses are restricted. So it's not just a matter of finding email addressed, but determining what kind.
Roger?
That's to be determined. Email addresses are not restricted.
Okay. So I guess stay tuned. Interesting things are happening. Well, it is 3 o'clock. I would like to thank you all for joining us and thank very much Roger and Susan Gray for participating in this webinar, and we will see you next month for a webinar relating to locks. Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Bonnie.